My name is Claire Whitmore. The day I got the call, my hands trembled so much I nearly dropped my phone. The offer was everything I had been working toward for more than a decade: senior event planner at the prestigious Willowbrook Cultural Center. A position that didn't just mean a better salary, but recognition, respect, and the kind of creative freedom I'd been dreaming of since my early 20s. Trust me, you'll regret skipping this story. So before you sit back and listen, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Grace's Truth. Now get in the mood to listen to this story because it might be the ultimate sweet revenge. When I hung up, I sat in silence for a moment, letting the reality sink in. I'd been through years of thankless jobs arranging fundraisers for organizations that didn't value my work, taking smaller contracts just to keep my resume alive after maternity leave, and balancing work with keeping our home running. And now finally the world had cracked open and offered me something bright, worthy, and exciting. I wanted my husband Mark to be the first to know. I pictured his face lighting up, maybe even opening a bottle of wine to celebrate. He had seen me burn the midnight oil studying design trends, negotiating contracts, and networking just to have a chance at a role like this. I thought no, I believed he'd be proud. When he walked through the door that evening, still in his navy work suit and carrying the faint smell of his cologne, I could hardly keep still. I got the job, I blurted out, my voice carrying more joy than I could contain. He stopped, set down his briefcase, and looked at me not with excitement, but with a peculiar, searching expression. That job, the one that's going to have you working nights and weekends. His tone was neutral, but his eyes were sharp. My smile faltered. Yes, the Willowbrook position. It's everything I've wanted, Mark. The projects they have lined up. He cut me off with a short laugh. Or maybe it's just an excuse. You sure this isn't about spending more time with certain people? For a second, I didn't even understand what he meant. My brain scrambled trying to find humor in his words, but his face didn't soften. He was serious. What are you talking about? I asked slowly. You're going to be surrounded by young, ambitious guys in suits, late nights, travel. You really expect me to believe it's all about the job? My first reaction was disbelief, then a prickle of something colder hurt. Mark had never been the overly romantic type, but he'd never outright accused me of being unfaithful. I opened my mouth to argue, but something in his stance told me this wasn't just a careless remark. I tried to push past it, sharing details about the role, the events I'd get to organize, the community impact. But every time I mentioned a male colleague's name from the interview panel, his eyebrow twitched, his jaw tightened. By the time dinner was over, the air between us had shifted. I went to bed that night with a knot in my stomach. This was supposed to be one of the happiest days of my life, yet I felt as if I'd stepped into a shadow I couldn't quite name. The next morning, while I was packing my bag for my first meeting with the Willowbrook team, Mark leaned against the doorway. I just hope he said casually, "You remember you're married." I froze mid-motion, my hand gripping the strap of my tote. Mark, why are you acting like this? I'm just saying, jobs like this change people. Don't let it change you in ways we can't fix. There was something ominous in the way he said it, as if he was planting a seed he expected to grow. I didn't argue, partly because I didn't want to start my first day in a cloud of tension, and partly because I was afraid of what I might say if I kept talking. When I arrived at the Willowbrook Center, it felt like walking into a dream. The grand lobby smelled faintly of polished wood and fresh flowers. Light streamed through tall glass windows, and the hum of creativity was everywhere, in the discussions echoing through the hall, the elegant displays lining the corridors, the buzz of an upcoming gala. My new colleagues welcomed me warmly, and for a few blissful hours I forgot the odd chill in my home life. But when I checked my phone during lunch, there was a text from Mark, "Who's Daniel?" It took me a moment to remember that Daniel was the assistant director I'd been paired with for the gala project. I'd mentioned his name once in passing at breakfast. My fingers hovered over the screen before I typed back, "A colleague." Why? No response came for nearly an hour, and when it did, it was a thumbs up emoji, nothing more. That night, I tried to tell myself I was imagining things, that Mark was simply insecure about the change in our lives. But as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental between us had shifted. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. The first week at Willowbrook should have been a golden memory, the kind you tuck away to smile at years later. Instead, it was laced with a strange undercurrent, like a song playing faintly off-key. Mark's suspicion didn't come as an outright confrontation, at least not at first. It arrived in small doses wrapped in humor that didn't feel funny. On Tuesday evening, I came home later than usual, my mind still buzzing from a meeting where we'd brainstormed an immersive cultural exhibit. I kicked off my heels and was halfway through telling Mark about the artist we'd just signed when he smirked and said, "Sounds like Daniel's keeping you busy." I froze mid-sentence. The way he said it, not playful, not curious, but almost testing, made my skin prickle. "Daniel is my colleague," I replied evenly. "We're working on the gala together, that's all." "Oh, I'm sure it's all," he said, dragging out the word. Then he chuckled as if it were just harmless teasing, but his eyes stayed locked on me, waiting for a reaction. I tried to brush it off, but the remark lodged in my mind. By Thursday, the jokes had multiplied. If my phone buzzed after 7 p.m., he'd glance at it and say, "Must be one of your fans from work." When I stayed late to finalize a vendor contract, he texted, "Working late," or "Working late." I didn't answer that one. It wasn't just the comments. He'd started keeping a mental inventory of my outfits, or so it seemed. One morning, as I slipped on a fitted navy dress, one I'd owned for years, he said, "You never wore that for me when we went out." "It's just a dress, Mark," I said, adjusting my necklace. "Right. Just a dress," he murmured almost to himself. At first, I told myself he was having trouble adjusting. After all, for years, I'd been the one with the flexible schedule, the one home for dinner, the one who managed the household details. Now my time belonged partly to someone else, to a place that valued me enough to demand my best hours. But there was something more insidious about his tone, as if he'd already written a version of events in his head and was just waiting for me to act it out. Friday night sealed the shift. I'd invited a few colleagues over for wine and cheese, a casual way to build rapport outside the office. Daniel was among them, along with two other women from the events team. I'd made it clear to Mark that it wasn't a party, just a small gathering. The evening went smoothly at first. We chatted about the upcoming gala, the logistics of installing the exhibit, even the absurdity of some last-minute budget cuts. Mark poured drinks and played the gracious host until Daniel complimented the vintage record player in our living room. Mark grinned and said, "Careful, Daniel. Next thing you know, Claire will be inviting you over to play records when I'm not home." The room went quiet for a beat too long. Daniel gave an awkward laugh, clearly unsure how to respond. I felt heat rush to my face, equal parts embarrassment and fury. I excused myself to the kitchen under the pretense of refreshing the cheese board, but really I needed a moment to steady my breathing. This wasn't teasing anymore. It was planting seeds of doubt in the minds of people I barely knew. When the guests left, I confronted him. "What was that supposed to mean?" I demanded, arms crossed. He shrugged, feigning innocence. "It was a joke." "Lighten up." "Mark, that wasn't a joke. That was humiliating for me and for you." His eyes hardened. "If you're so defensive, maybe there's something to be defensive about." That sentence was like a match thrown into dry grass. I could feel the heat of my anger rising, but I forced myself to walk away before it turned into a full-blown fight. That night, I lay awake listening to his even breathing beside me, wondering how we had gotten here so fast. My job hadn't even reached its first full month, and already the trust between us felt as fragile as spun glass. I didn't know it yet, but these little cracks were the start of something much deeper and much darker than I was prepared for. The following week, the tension thickened like a storm cloud that refused to move on. Mark's suspicion stopped hiding behind humor. Instead, it began creeping into my private spaces, places I had always assumed were safe. It started one Tuesday morning. I was in the shower when I heard my phone buzz on the nightstand. By the time I stepped out, towel wrapped tightly around me, my phone was no longer where I'd left it. I found it in Mark's hands as he stood by the dresser, scrolling with a concentration that made my chest tighten. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. He didn't even flinch. "Just checking something." "Checking what?" "That's my phone." He finally looked up, his expression calm, almost smug. "If you have nothing to hide, why does it matter?" It mattered because it wasn't about hiding anything. It was about trust, about the fact that he clearly didn't believe me anymore. I snatched the phone from him, my heart thudding hard enough to hurt. "I don't check your phone," I said quietly. "Maybe you should," he replied, then turned and walked out as if the conversation was over. That night, the unease grew. I stayed late at Willowbrook for a planning session. A high-profile donor had offered to loan several rare artifacts for the gala, and the logistics were delicate. When I came home, Mark was sitting in the dark, the television off, a single lamp casting shadows across his face. "You didn't answer my text," he said. "I didn't see it," I explained, dropping my bag by the door. "I was in the middle of—" "I used Find My Phone," he interrupted. "You were at the downtown restaurant." For a moment, I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. "Yes, with my team. We met the donor there. I told you about this at breakfast." He didn't respond right away. His gaze was steady, his silence heavy, as if he were daring me to slip. "Just remember, Claire," he finally said, "people get caught because they think they're too careful to be caught." I went to bed that night with my stomach knotted, the edges of my dream job beginning to fray under the weight of his mistrust. The next breach came 2 days later. I was at work when my email session suddenly logged out. I thought it was a system glitch until I received a notification that my account had been accessed from a different device. At home, my laptop was open on the kitchen table, my inbox pulled up. I confronted Mark that evening. "You read my emails, I skimmed them," he corrected, his tone infuriatingly casual. "I wanted to see if you were being honest about who you're talking to." "That's not skimming, Mark. That's surveillance." He leaned back in his chair, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Big word. You make it sound sinister." "It is sinister," I said, my voice rising despite my effort to keep calm. "You're crossing every line there is. Lines are for people you trust," he replied, standing up. "And right now, I don't." His words were like ice water down my back. It wasn't even about an affair in his mind anymore. It was about control, about having the right to monitor me, simply because he felt entitled to it. By Friday, I started noticing little things that hinted this had been going on longer than I realized. The screen brightness on my phone was slightly dimmer than I usually kept it. My handbag straps weren't positioned the way I left them. My desk drawer at home was open just a fraction when I knew I'd closed it. That weekend, we were invited to my friend Laura's birthday dinner. I had planned to go alone since Mark claimed he was too tired, but when I was halfway to the car, he suddenly appeared dressed and ready. "Wouldn't want people thinking I can't keep up with my wife's busy schedule," he said. At the restaurant, he positioned himself beside me, his hand resting heavily on the back of my chair, as if staking a claim. When a male guest from Laura's office struck up a casual conversation with me about the cultural center, Mark leaned in and said, "Careful, she's married." His smile was polite, but the words carried an edge sharp enough to slice the air between us. On the drive home, I stared out the window, wondering how the man I had married, the one who once encouraged me to chase my dreams, had turned into someone who saw my success as a threat. I had a creeping sense that this wasn't going to stop on its own. It was only going to escalate. And deep down, I already knew I wasn't wrong. I wish I could say Mark's behavior stayed behind closed doors, confined to tense silences and barbed remarks only I had to endure. But no, it spilled out into the open where others could see, and worse, where I couldn't hide my humiliation. It began on a Saturday evening when we were invited to a dinner party at the home of one of his colleagues. I didn't particularly want to go. I was exhausted after a week of back-to-back meetings for the Willowbrook Gala, but declining would only add fuel to his narrative that I was too busy for our life together. So I went. The living room was warm with the scent of roast lamb and the low hum of polite conversation. I recognized a few faces, mostly other spouses, and made an effort to be friendly. When the conversation turned to careers, I felt a small swell of pride as I described my new role, the upcoming gala, and some of the fascinating people I'd met. That's when Mark chimed in, his voice just a little louder than necessary. She's practically married to her work now, and maybe to one of her coworkers too. The table laughed lightly, assuming it was a joke. But his eyes stayed fixed on me, watching for my reaction. My cheeks burned. I tried to smooth it over with a strained smile and a deflection, but the damage was done. Even if they didn't believe him, they'd remember he'd said it. Later, while I was chatting with the host's wife about local art exhibits, Mark wandered over and interrupted us. "Careful talking about art with her," he said to the woman. "Next thing you know, she'll invite you to some late-night planning session at her office." The woman's smile faltered. I could feel the heat creeping up my neck, and my voice wavered as I excused myself to the bathroom. I locked the door and gripped the sink, staring at my reflection. My lipstick had faded, my hair had loosened from its careful style, and in my eyes I saw something I hated: shame. I wasn't ashamed because I'd done anything wrong. I was ashamed because I was letting him turn me into someone who tiptoed through conversations, someone who swallowed words, rather than risk giving him more ammunition. The following week, the public jabs grew bolder. At a neighborhood barbecue, a friend of ours asked how the new job was going. I had barely begun to answer before Mark laughed and said, "She's living her best life out every night, dressed to kill. I'm just the guy who pays the mortgage." People chuckled awkwardly, but my friend's eyes flicked to mine, and I knew she could see I wasn't laughing. One incident, though, burned more than the rest. Willowbrook had invited staff to a donor appreciation dinner at an upscale restaurant. Partners were welcome, and I thought it might be a way to show Mark that my work events weren't what he imagined that they were: professional, structured, and entirely above board. From the moment we walked in, he seemed determined to prove me wrong. He interrupted conversations, steered them toward innuendo, and when one of the donors, a dignified man in his 70s, complimented my presentation skills, Mark said, "She's always been good at charming the men." The table went silent. The donor's smile faded into confusion, and I felt the air thicken with discomfort. I wanted to vanish under the tablecloth. On the ride home, I confronted him. "Do you have any idea how inappropriate that was?" I said, my voice low but trembling. He didn't even glance at me. "I'm just being honest. Maybe if you didn't get so cozy with people, there wouldn't be anything to comment on." "It's my job to be personable, Mark. To build relationships." "Sure. Call it whatever you want." He said, his mouth curling into a half smile. "We both know there's more to it." That night, lying awake beside him, I realized the public humiliation was no accident. It was strategic. Each time he made one of those comments in front of others, he was rewriting the story, painting me as untrustworthy, so that if our marriage unraveled, he could say it was because of me. It wasn't just about mistrust anymore. It was about control, perception, and ownership of my reputation. And I knew sooner or later I was going to have to fight back. The morning it happened, the air in our kitchen felt different, heavy, like the seconds before a thunderstorm breaks. I was halfway through buttering a piece of toast when Mark set his coffee mug down with a deliberate clink. "We need to talk about this job," he said. I didn't look up right away. "We've been talking about it for weeks." "No," he said, his voice sharper. "We've been dancing around it. I'm done pretending. You need to quit." I froze mid-motion, knife in hand. "Excuse me." "You heard me." He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "This job is tearing us apart. You're never home. You're dressing up for other men. You're hiding things. I'm not hiding anything. My voice rose before I could stop it. And I'm not dressing up for other men. I'm dressing for my career, Mark. For me. His eyes narrowed. You used to dress for me. The absurdity of it nearly made me laugh, but the truth was I was too angry. I set the knife down slowly, the butter cooling into a pale smear on my toast. This job means something to me. I've worked for it for years. You knew that when I applied, and I didn't think it would turn you into someone I barely recognize, he shot back. It's simple, Claire. Our marriage or your job. Pick one. The words hit like a slap. I stared at him, searching for the man who had once told me he loved how ambitious I was. I couldn't find him. You're asking me to give up the thing that finally makes me feel alive again, I said softly. I'm asking you to save what we have. He countered, his voice low and controlled. You think this is about me being jealous? No, it's about priorities. And yours are wrong. For the first time in a long while, I didn't answer. Instead, I stood, gathered my bag and coat, and walked out the door without another word. All day at Willowbrook, his ultimatum echoed in my mind. The gala was only weeks away, and quitting now would not only crush me, but also put the entire team in chaos. I thought of the donors, the community, the years I'd spent building the skills to earn this position. Could I really walk away from that because my husband couldn't trust me? That night when I came home, he was waiting in the living room, the television off, the room dim except for a single lamp. He didn't ask about my day. Instead, he slid a piece of paper across the coffee table. It was a resignation letter, already typed, my name neatly placed at the bottom, just waiting for my signature. My stomach turned. You wrote this? I'm helping you do the right thing, he said flatly. Just sign it. I'm not signing anything, I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. His jaw tightened. You will. If you care about this marriage, you will. I realized in that moment that this wasn't just about a job. This was about control, my independence, my identity. And Mark was willing to crush both to keep me under his thumb. I didn't sign the letter. I didn't even touch it. But as I lay in bed later staring into the dark, I knew that defiance came at a price. And I had a sinking feeling he was about to make me pay it. I found out by accident. It was a Wednesday evening, and I'd left Willowbrook later than usual after finalizing contracts for the gala's floral arrangements. My feet ached in my heels, and all I wanted was a quiet dinner and maybe a hot bath. When I reached home, Mark's car wasn't in the driveway, unusual for that hour. I assumed he was working late or running an errand. But when he came in about half an hour later, his shirt sleeves were rolled up. His tie loosened, and there was a faint smell of cold air clinging to him, as though he'd been outside for a long time. I thought nothing of it until I went into the study later that night to grab a folder. Mark's laptop was open on the desk screen, still lit. I didn't mean to snoop, but my eyes caught the thumbnail of a photo, a blurry shot of me standing outside a cafe with my coworker Daniel. My pulse spiked. I clicked. There were more. One of me walking into the cultural center, another of me unlocking my car in the staff parking lot. One where I was standing on the sidewalk talking to a female colleague, cropped so tightly it looked almost intimate. The timestamps matched various days over the past 2 weeks. I stepped back from the desk as if the laptop itself might burn me. My mind whirled. He's been following me. When I confronted him, he didn't even try to deny it. Of course I followed you, he said, his voice infuriatingly calm. I needed proof. Proof of what? My voice cracked, part fury, part disbelief. Proof of what you're really doing when you say you're working late. That photo with Daniel. You looked close. I felt my hands shaking. We were standing outside the cafe because the meeting room was full. We were talking about table layouts for the gala. That's what you'd say, he muttered. I stared at him, struggling to reconcile this man with the one I'd built a life with. You're twisting everything I do into something dirty. You're giving me reasons to, he said coldly. I couldn't stay in the room with him another second. I grabbed my coat and walked out into the night, pacing up and down the sidewalk, my breath visible in the cold air. My heart was pounding, not just from anger, but from a deep, gnawing fear. This wasn't jealousy anymore. This was obsession. Over the next few days, the tension thickened until it felt like I was moving through smoke. I started noticing his car parked across the street from Willowbrook when I left in the evenings. Once I caught sight of him in the lobby pretending to look at the brochures. It all came to a head the following Monday. I was leading a walkthrough of the gala venue with the team when I spotted him half hidden behind a decorative column phone in hand camera lens aimed in my direction. My chest went cold. I walked straight over to him, my heels clicking hard against the marble. Leave. Now. I'm not leaving until I know the truth. He said, his voice low but firm. This is the truth, I shot back, gesturing toward my team. This is my work. These are my colleagues. You have no right to follow me here. We were attracting attention. I could see Daniel and the others glancing over, whispering. Mark's eyes darted past me to them. They're not as innocent as you think. I took a deep breath, forcing my voice steady. Go home, Mark. Or I swear I'll call security. Something flickered in his expression, anger, maybe humiliation, before he turned on his heel and walked out. But the damage was done. My colleagues had seen. My carefully guarded professional image had a crack in it now, and I knew Mark had put it there deliberately. At that moment, I realized this wasn't going to end on its own. He wasn't going to stop until he broke something: my job, my reputation, or me. And I was starting to think he wouldn't care which. The night of the donor preview dinner had been circled on my calendar for months. It wasn't just another event. It was the event, the one that would either cement my standing at Willowbrook or cast doubt on why I'd been hired in the first place. The room had to be perfect. Every place card handwritten in sweeping script, every floral centerpiece angled just right under the warm amber glow of the chandeliers. The caterers moved like clockwork in the background, their silver trays gleaming under the soft lights. I'd been up since 5 a.m. running last-minute checks, adjusting the lighting, ensuring the wine list matched the rare vintage one donor insisted on. My head buzzed with both nerves and anticipation, but it was a good kind of buzz, the kind that makes you feel alive. By 7 o'clock, the guests were arriving: trustees in tailored suits, local art patrons in silk and pearls, and reporters with their notepads tucked discreetly under their arms. My boss, Victoria, floated around like a queen, greeting everyone with her usual blend of charm and calculation. I was in the middle of introducing a major donor to one of our featured artists when the air shifted. I felt it before I saw it, the subtle ripple of conversations, faltering eyes flicking toward the entrance. I turned and my stomach dropped. Mark. He was standing in the doorway, still in his work clothes, but with his tie askew, scanning the room like a predator who had just spotted his prey. Our eyes met, and the corner of his mouth lifted, not a smile, but the expression of someone who knew they were about to ruin something for you. I started toward him, weaving through the crowd with a fixed smile plastered on my face, hoping I could intercept him before anyone else could piece together what was happening. What are you doing here? I hissed under my breath when I reached him. Thought I'd see this work of yours for myself, he said, his eyes sweeping the room in deliberate slowness. Doesn't look so different from a cocktail party to me. This is a professional event. I said, my tone low and clipped. You need to leave. Why? He asked, his voice loud enough that the couple nearest us turned to glance over. Afraid I'll see you in action, Mark. I began, but he stepped past me before I could stop him. I followed, my heart hammering, as he approached the table where Daniel stood talking to a group of guests. Mark inserted himself into the conversation with a handshake that was a shade too firm. So you're Daniel? He said, his smile tight. I've heard a lot about you. Daniel looked caught between confusion and politeness. I'm sure it's all good things. Mark's laugh was sharp. Depends on your definition of good. The silence that followed was suffocating. I stepped in my hand lightly on Mark's arm, my voice strained but even. Let's go. Now. But instead of leaving, he pulled his phone from his pocket and, God help me, began swiping through the photos he'd taken of me over the past weeks. Maybe some of you would like to see what working late looks like, he said to the stunned group. A cold wave swept over me. My boss's voice cut through the tension, calm but firm. Sir, I think it's best you step outside. Mark glanced at her, his lip curling. I'm not finished. Yes, you are. Victoria interrupted, nodding toward the security guard stationed by the door. The guard moved forward, and for a second I thought Mark might resist. But then he shoved his phone back in his pocket and let himself be escorted out, though not without turning back to throw me one last look, a mix of defiance and triumph, as if he'd just won something. I stood there, my cheeks burning, the chatter of the room resuming in awkward bursts around me. Daniel avoided my eyes. I forced myself to walk back into the flow of the event, to keep smiling, to pretend as if the floor hadn't just opened beneath my feet. When the last guest left, I stayed behind, stacking stray champagne flutes and checking the tables for forgotten purses. Victoria approached, her expression unreadable. Claire, she said, I'm sorry about whatever that was. But it can't happen again. Do you understand? Yes, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She touched my arm lightly. You're good at what you do. Don't let this derail you. Then she walked away, leaving me alone in the echoing room. Driving home, I rehearsed what I would say to Mark. I thought of the humiliation, the breach of boundaries, the sheer recklessness of what he'd done. I imagined shouting, crying, demanding answers. But when I walked through the door, he was sitting on the couch, looking almost smug. Guess your friends know the truth now, he said. I stood in the doorway, my coat still on, my keys still in hand. The truth, I asked quietly. That you're not who they think you are, he said. That maybe your job isn't as squeaky clean as you pretend. I stared at him, and for the first time I didn't feel anger. I felt clarity. A cold, sharp understanding that this wasn't a misunderstanding or insecurity or even jealousy. This was deliberate. He wanted to break me. And for the first time, I thought, I can't live like this anymore. I didn't say it out loud, not yet. But the seed was planted deep and resolute. And I knew it was only a matter of time before it grew into a choice that would change everything. I didn't speak to Mark about the donor dinner for 2 days. It wasn't avoidance. It was strategy. I've learned that when someone like him wants a reaction, the best way to unnerve them is to deny it, at least at first. So I carried on with a practiced calm, going to work, tending to the usual routines, while my mind quietly built the framework for a conversation that I knew might end up deciding the fate of our marriage. I wanted to be deliberate. I wanted to be the one who set the tone. Sunday morning felt right. He was always slower on Sundays, no alarm clock blaring, no tie knotted tight around his neck, no conference calls or emails to distract him. Just coffee, the newspaper, and his guard a little lower. I woke early before him and sat in the kitchen with my hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, staring out the window at the frost clinging to the grass. My reflection in the glass looked tired, but there was a steeliness in my eyes I hadn't noticed before. That look that was new, that was survival. When Mark shuffled in, robe cinched loosely at the waist, he grunted a casual morning and reached for the coffee pot. I didn't answer. I just watched him add his 2 scoops of sugar stir. His movements were the same as they'd been every morning for years, but something about the normalcy made my stomach twist. How could someone who moved through life so routinely be capable of creating so much chaos in mine? He sat down across from me, flipping open the paper, the rustle of it loud in the stillness. I let him read a few lines before I spoke. We need to talk about what happened at the donor dinner, I said evenly. Without looking up, he replied, "We already did." "No," I said, my voice firmer. "We didn't. What happened was, you barged into my workplace in front of my boss and high-profile donors and tried to humiliate me. You ambushed me, Mark. That's not insecurity. That's cruelty." That got his attention. The newspaper lowered slowly. His eyes met mine, cool and assessing. "I told you before I was looking out for our marriage." I felt my jaw clench. By following me for weeks, by taking photos without my knowledge, by showing up at a formal work event uninvited and implying to my colleagues that I'm having an affair, I was looking for the truth, he said, as if that explained everything. "The truth," I repeated, leaning forward. "The truth is that you've been inventing lies about me and then acting like you've caught me in them. The truth is that you're trying to destroy my reputation because you can't stand the fact that I have a life outside of you." He smirked then, a sharp, humorless curve of the mouth that I'd come to recognize as his way of trying to make me feel small. "You have been different since you started this job." I didn't flinch. Different how? More confident. More independent. He said the word like it was something dangerous. "You come home with that sparkle in your eyes, talking about your projects, about your colleagues. You're dressing better, smiling more, leaving earlier, coming home later. And I know it's not because of me." The absurdity of it made me laugh softly, a sound without joy. "So I'm guilty because I'm happy, because I'm proud of the work I'm doing." "You're guilty because you're not the same woman I married," he said flatly. That's when it hit me like a cold wave. He didn't want me to be happy unless the happiness was because of him. And he didn't want me to be strong if that strength wasn't in service of him. "You don't like me being happy unless you can take credit for it," I said. "That's not what I said. It's exactly what you said," I countered. "You can't stand that this job has given me confidence, recognition, and independence, things you no longer control. You want me smaller, easier to manage. You want me to need you more than I need myself." His jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. And in his silence, I could see it, the truth he'd never admit out loud. "You keep accusing me of cheating," I continued. "But that's not what this is about. This is about you realizing you can't control me anymore. And you're scared." His eyes narrowed. "Careful, Claire." I didn't back down. "No. You be careful. Because this, the spying, the accusations, the public humiliation, it stops. Now. If it happens again, I will leave. And not for a night. Not for a week. For good." There was a pause, the air between us thick enough to choke on. Then he leaned back, crossing his arms. "You wouldn't try me." I stood up, my coffee still half full, and walked into the living room. My hands were trembling, but it wasn't from fear. It was from adrenaline, from the rush of saying out loud what I'd been holding inside for weeks. I sat on the couch staring at the silent television and realized that I had crossed a threshold. This wasn't just a warning to him, it was a promise to myself. If he stepped over that line again, I wouldn't just talk about leaving, I'd do it. The rest of the day unfolded in a strange, brittle quiet. We moved around each other like actors hitting their marks, speaking only when necessary, our tones careful and neutral. But I could feel him watching me the way you might watch a candle burn lower, waiting to see if it will go out on its own. That night when we went to bed, we lay with our backs to each other. I stared into the dark, listening to the rhythm of his breathing. My mind kept replaying his face at the gala, that smirk, that deliberate defiance, and I knew something had shifted permanently. I wasn't naive enough to think that my words alone would change him. I wasn't hoping for a tearful apology or a miraculous transformation. No, I'd seen enough to know that if anything, this confrontation might make him more cunning. But it also meant something else. He now knew I was ready to walk away. And that knowledge gave me power, not the kind I wanted, but the kind I might have to use. I fell asleep with one thought looping in my mind, steady as a heartbeat. If he does it again, I'm gone. I didn't tell anyone about what happened at the donor dinner right away. For a couple of days, I carried it alone, nursing the humiliation in silence. I told myself it was because I didn't want to drag other people into our mess, but the truth was, I was afraid. Afraid of what they'd say once I gave them the full picture. Afraid they'd confirm the thing I was still resisting admitting to myself, that this marriage wasn't just broken, it was dangerous to me in ways I hadn't fully realized. On Wednesday evening, after a particularly long day at Willowbrook, I finally called my sister Erin. She picked up on the second ring, her voice warm and familiar. "Hey, stranger," she said. "Haven't heard from you in a while. Everything okay?" I almost said yes. Almost. But instead, I sank into the couch, kicking off my heels, and said, "No, it's not." She didn't interrupt, just waited. I told her everything about the way Mark had been making those sharp, insinuating jokes for weeks. The phone checks, the email, snooping the surveillance photos, and finally the scene at the donor dinner. I tried to keep my voice level clinical even, but by the end my throat was tight and my hands were trembling. There was a long silence on the other end before she spoke. "Claire, that's not normal. That's not insecurity. That's control. And it's escalating." "I know," I whispered. "But I don't know what to do. If I leave, he'll make it ugly. He'll make sure everyone thinks I left because I was cheating." Aaron's voice was steady, but there was steel under it. "Let him think what he wants. People who know you won't believe him, and the ones who do, they're not worth worrying about. What matters is you, your safety, your sanity." Her certainty shook something in me. Aaron has never been one for dramatics. If she was this firm, it meant she truly believed I was in trouble. Still, I couldn't quite picture walking out, not yet. The house, the shared finances, the tangle of our lives. It all felt too heavy to just drop. But I could take steps. Quiet ones. The next day, I reached out to someone I trusted at Willowbrook, Victoria. Not as my boss, but as a woman I'd always sensed had weathered her own storms. We met in her office after lunch, the door closed, blinds half drawn. "I want to tell you something off the record." I began, my voice low. "And I need you to keep it between us." Victoria leaned back in her chair, her eyes sharp but kind. "Go on." I told her not every detail, but enough. The accusations, the uninvited appearance at the gala, the way it had undercut my credibility in front of the donors. She listened without interrupting, her fingers steepled under her chin. When I finished, she said, "I believe you. And I'm going to say this plainly, you need to protect yourself. Document everything. Dates, times, what he says, what he does. If he shows up here again and causes a scene, we'll have grounds to involve security immediately, and I'll back you up." Her words were like a weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying, suddenly shifting off my shoulders. It wasn't just that she believed me, it was that she was offering concrete steps. "I hate that it's come to this," I said quietly. Victoria gave a small, knowing smile. "Sometimes you have to stop thinking about what you hate and start thinking about what you can't survive. If you can't survive staying, then you plan to leave, and you do it smart." That night, I started a folder on my laptop, encrypted, password protected. I scanned the resignation letter he'd tried to make me sign. I wrote down every incident I could remember from the past month with dates and times. I even transferred some savings into an account only I could access. It felt covert, almost treacherous, but each step steadied me. Over the next week, I noticed something strange. The more I quietly prepared, the calmer I felt around Mark. It was like the fear had been replaced with a different kind of energy, not exactly confidence, but readiness. But Mark wasn't calming down. If anything, his behavior became more unpredictable. One evening, I came home to find him in the garage, leaning against my car with his arms crossed. "Where were you?" he asked, his tone deceptively casual. "I told you, staff meeting." He nodded slowly. "You didn't answer your phone." "It was on silent," I replied, brushing past him. "You're getting good at excuses," he said to my back. I didn't rise to it. I just went inside, poured myself a glass of water, and let the comment hang in the air. That more than anything seemed to throw him off the fact that I wasn't snapping back anymore. 2 nights later, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing on the nightstand. It was Erin texting me a simple question. Have you thought about when I stared at the screen, my heart thudding? I knew what she meant. I typed back soon, because by then the idea wasn't hypothetical anymore. It wasn't if, it was when. And though I hadn't told Mark yet, I think he could feel it. The shift in me, the quiet resolve, the unspoken truth that I was no longer trapped in his version of the story. I didn't plan to give Mark an ultimatum that night. In fact, when I left work, my only intention was to come home, take a long shower, and fall into bed, without exchanging more than a handful of words with him. But life has a way of collapsing the distance between the decision you think you're not ready to make and the moment you realize you've already made it. It was a Thursday, cold enough that the air bit at my cheeks on the walk from the parking lot to the front door. I stepped inside to find the house dark, save for the faint blue glow of the television in the living room. Mark was on the couch. Shoes still on his tie, loosened, a beer sweating in his hand. "You're late," he said, eyes fixed on the screen. "Board meeting ran over," I replied, setting my bag down. "You could have called if you were worried." His eyes flicked to me, then sharp and deliberate. "I wasn't worried. I was wondering who you were with." The sting of it was familiar now, but that didn't make it hurt any less. I stood there, still in my coat, staring at him, and something in me finally snapped into alignment. I was done waiting for him to become the man I married. I was done explaining myself to someone who had no interest in hearing the truth. "We're going to talk," I said. He smirked. "We're talking now." "No," I said, my voice steady but low. "We're going to talk, and you're going to listen. You can decide what you want to do after you've heard me." He turned off the TV, leaned back, and spread his arms along the back of the couch, like a king granting an audience. "Go ahead." I sat across from him, perching on the edge of the armchair. "Mark, your behavior has crossed every line. You've accused me of cheating without a shred of evidence. You've followed me, taken photos of me without my knowledge, read my private messages and emails. You've humiliated me in front of my colleagues and my boss. And you've done all of it under the guise of protecting our marriage." He held up a hand. "I've done it because you've been lying." "Stop," I said sharply. "This isn't a debate. I've been more than patient, more than understanding. But I'm not going to live like this. So here's the choice: you make an appointment with a counselor and we start working on this together, or I leave." He let out a short, humorless laugh. "You're giving me an ultimatum?" "Yes," I said. "Because we've run out of other options." His expression hardened. "And what happens if I say no? Then I start making arrangements." I said plainly, "For myself." For a moment I thought he might yell. I could see the flicker of temper in his eyes, the way his jaw flexed like he was clamping down on the words. But instead he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You think I'm going to sit in some office and have a stranger tell me what's wrong with me?" he asked. "I think if you want this marriage to survive, you will," I said. "And if I don't care whether it survives?" he asked, his voice low, almost conversational. The question landed like a punch to the gut. I stared at him, waiting for some sign that he was bluffing, that he'd take it back. But he didn't. He just sat there, calm, as if he'd simply stated a fact. "Then you've just told me everything I need to know," I said quietly. We sat in silence for a long moment. The clock on the wall ticked, the sound unnaturally loud. I thought about all the years we'd spent together, the early days when he'd been attentive, when I'd believed he was my partner in every sense of the word. How that man had slowly been replaced by someone who saw my independence as a threat. "I'm not going to counseling," he said finally. "I'm not going to sit there and have someone gang up on me. And if you want to walk out because of that, then go ahead." Something inside me went still. He was daring me. Not because he thought I wouldn't leave, but because he didn't believe I could. "Okay," I said. I stood, smoothed the front of my skirt, and walked toward the hallway. "That's it," he called after me. "That's it," I said, without looking back. In the bedroom, I shut the door and locked it, not because I thought he'd hurt me, but because I wanted the physical barrier. I sat on the edge of the bed and took out my phone. I texted Erin. He said no. I'm leaving. Her reply came almost immediately. Tell me when. I'll help. The next morning, I woke before dawn and moved through the house quietly, taking mental inventory of what I'd need to take with me, what I'd leave behind. It was strange the fear I'd expected to feel wasn't there. In its place was a calm, deliberate resolve. Later that day, during my lunch break, I called a counselor not for us, but for me. I told her I needed help navigating the next steps of leaving a controlling relationship. She didn't sound surprised. She just asked me when I could come in. As I hung up, I realized something: the ultimatum I'd given Mark wasn't really for him. It was for me. A line in the sand, one I'd drawn, knowing full well he'd step over it. And now that he had, I was free to cross my own line, the one that led out the door. I wasn't gone yet. But in my heart, the leaving had already begun. Leaving a marriage isn't like quitting a job. It's not just packing a box and walking out the door. It's slow, deliberate, methodical, especially when you're leaving someone who thrives on control. One wrong move and they'll sense it clamp down harder, make the exit a battlefield. After Mark refused counseling, I knew there was no going back. I also knew I couldn't just announce I was leaving and expect him to accept it quietly. He'd fight not for me, but for the power he'd lose when I was gone. So I started preparing. The first step was financial. I'd already opened a separate account weeks earlier after talking to Victoria, but now I started moving small amounts into it every few days. Not enough for him to notice, just enough to start building a safety net. I cut my personal spending to the bone. Ate lunch at my desk, and even sold a few designer handbags I no longer used. Every dollar I set aside felt like a brick in the foundation of my freedom. The second step was practical. I made copies of important documents: my passport, birth certificate, bank statements, my employment contract. I kept them in a plain folder tucked into the bottom of a box in my office at Willowbrook. If Mark decided to play dirty, I wasn't going to be left scrambling. The third step was emotional. This one was harder. I had to start separating my life from his in small, almost invisible ways. I stopped telling him about my day, not just to avoid his suspicion, but to reclaim my privacy. I stopped asking for his opinion on anything, even trivial matters like what to cook for dinner. Every choice I made without his input was a reminder to myself that I didn't need his approval to exist. I also began leaning more on Erin. We spoke almost every night, usually after Mark had gone to bed. She never pushed, never asked if I'd set a date to leave. She just listened, and sometimes that was enough. "You're doing this the smart way," she told me one night. "Quietly. On your terms. That's how you win against someone like him." Winning wasn't what it felt like. Most days it felt like moving through fog, functional but numb. I kept my head down at home, careful not to provoke him, all the while making progress behind the scenes. Then came the night that almost blew my cover. It was a Friday, and Willowbrook was hosting a small pre-gala mixer for the press. It wasn't a big event, but it was important, a chance to generate buzz before the main fundraiser. I had been dreading the possibility of Mark showing up, so I'd told him it was just a staff meeting that might run late. Halfway through the evening, as I was chatting with a journalist from the city paper, I felt a shift in the room. My skin prickled before I even turned around, and there he was, standing by the door, scanning the crowd. My stomach dropped. I walked over, forcing a smile for the sake of anyone watching. "What are you doing here?" I asked under my breath. "Thought I'd surprise you," he said, his eyes sweeping over my dress. "Looks like I caught you at a party instead of a meeting." "This is work," I said. "You need to leave." Instead, he stepped further into the room, ignoring me. "I just want to see who you're working so hard for." I knew then I had two choices: create a scene trying to force him out or diffuse it by pretending everything was fine. I chose the latter, smiling tightly and introducing him to a couple of colleagues all the while, praying he'd get bored and leave. He didn't. He stayed for nearly an hour, drifting between groups, making subtle but cutting remarks that only I seemed to catch. "Claire's been very busy lately," he told one reporter with a knowing look. Sometimes I wonder if I should be jealous. By the time he finally left, my jaw ached from holding my smile in place. When I got home later that night, he was waiting in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with a beer in hand. "See, that wasn't so bad," he said. I didn't answer. I just walked past him to the bedroom, my mind already rewriting my plan. I couldn't afford to wait much longer, not if he was going to keep showing up in my professional space. The next morning, I called Erin. "I need to move sooner," I said. "How soon?" she asked. "Within the month." We worked out the details over the next week. She had a friend with a small furnished apartment who was willing to rent it short term. It wasn't fancy, but it was clean, safe, and mine. I began moving things there in small increments: a box of clothes here, a set of toiletries there. If Mark noticed anything missing, he didn't mention it. But I knew I couldn't just disappear without telling him. That would make things messier than they needed to be. I needed one last push, one final moment that made it clear to both of us that leaving was the only option left. That moment came sooner than I expected, at the worst possible time, the night of the gala itself. But that's a story for the next part. The morning of the Willowbrook Gala felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. Months of planning had funneled into this single night. Every detail had been obsessed over: the lighting, the table arrangements, the catering menu, even the placement of the silent auction items. This was the event that could cement my reputation as the go-to coordinator for the city's most prestigious gatherings. It was also, as I kept reminding myself, the last big hurdle before I left Mark. I woke early before dawn and sat on the edge of the bed, running through my mental checklist. Mark was still asleep, his back to me, his breathing even. I watched him for a moment, wondering if he sensed that I was already half gone. If he did, he didn't show it. By late afternoon, the venue was a flurry of controlled chaos. The stage crew was testing the sound system, florists were positioning towering arrangements of white orchids, and waitstaff glided between tables, polishing glassware to a sparkle. I moved among them, clipboard in hand, answering questions, making adjustments. I felt alive. This was my element, my talent, my proof that I was more than someone's wife. Around 6:30, guests began to arrive: trustees in black tie, benefactors in sweeping gowns. I positioned myself near the entrance, greeting people warmly, introducing them to each other, smoothing over the occasional awkward moment. Everything was going exactly as I'd envisioned until I turned toward the doors and saw him. Mark. My stomach tightened, but I forced my expression to stay neutral. He was dressed in a charcoal suit, crisp white shirt, no tie, casual enough to look out of place among the tuxedos, but polished enough that no one could accuse him of being sloppy. I crossed the room quickly, intercepting him before he could get too far inside. "What are you doing here?" I said quietly. My smile frozen in place. "Supporting my wife," he replied, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "You weren't invited," I said, keeping my voice low. "I didn't realize I needed an invitation to see what's been keeping you out every night." He said, his gaze flicking toward a cluster of my colleagues. "Mark," I warned, "this is my workplace. Don't make a scene." "Relax," he said, smirking. "I'm just here to watch." I wanted to push him out the door, but I couldn't risk a visible altercation. Too many eyes, too much at stake. So I did what I'd done before. I smiled tightly, introduced him to a couple of board members, and moved on, hoping he'd get bored and leave. But Mark never did anything quietly. Over the next hour, I spotted him weaving through the crowd, slipping into conversations that had nothing to do with him. He lingered near the bar, chatting with one of the younger female staffers, then made his way to the silent auction tables, where he stood just close enough to overhear donor conversations. I kept moving, pretending not to notice, but my pulse was a steady drumbeat of dread. The breaking point came just before the keynote speech. I was standing near the stage, checking that the microphone was live, when I heard Mark's voice loud, carrying over the low hum of conversation. Claire's been so dedicated to this gala, he was telling a small group that included Daniel, my coworker. She's practically been married to the cultural center these past few months. I barely see her anymore. But I guess when you've got such charming company. He gestured toward Daniel, his smile sharp as glass. I felt the blood rush to my face. Daniel's expression tightened, and one of the donors glanced at me with a flicker of discomfort. I walked over my heels, clicking against the marble floor. "Mark, can I speak to you for a moment?" "Of course," he said, still smiling, and followed me toward a side corridor. The moment we were out of earshot, I dropped the smile. "You need to leave." "Now." "I was just making conversation," he said, all innocence. "No." I snapped, my voice low and deadly. "You were trying to undermine me in front of my colleagues and the people I've worked months to impress. This ends tonight." He shrugged. "If you're this defensive, maybe they should know why." That was it. The last thread snapped. I stepped closer, my voice shaking but steady. "We're done, Mark. After tonight, I'm leaving. You won't have to wonder where I am or who I'm with, because it won't be you." For the first time in a long while, his smirk faltered. "You don't mean that." "I've never meant anything more," I said. We stared at each other for a long, taut moment. Then I turned and walked away, leaving him standing in the corridor. I returned to the gala with my shoulders squared, my face composed. The keynote began, and I slipped into the back of the room, letting the words wash over me. I'd done my job. The event was a success. And in a few days, I'd be free. When I got home that night, Mark wasn't there. I didn't care where he was. I went straight to the bedroom, pulled out the small suitcase I'd hidden under the bed, and began to pack. The plan was no longer a plan. It was in motion. I didn't sleep much the night after the gala. Not because I was second-guessing my decision, but because my mind was moving too quickly, lining up each step like dominoes. The moment I'd told Mark I was leaving, something had shifted inside me, a lock had turned, and there was no going back. By sunrise, I was already up, showered and dressed. The suitcase I'd started packing the night before sat by the bedroom door, half full. I didn't want to take much, just the essentials. I wasn't leaving to start a new life with all my possessions neatly in place. I was leaving to start a new life without him. Everything else could be replaced. Aaron had texted me at 6:30. "Let me know when you're ready. I'll be out front." I moved through the house quietly. Mark still wasn't home. I didn't know if he'd stayed out all night or come back and left again, but I didn't care. The silence gave me the space to work quickly. In the kitchen, I packed a small tote with my favorite mug, a few pantry staples, and the photo of my parents I kept on the fridge. In the study, I slid the folder of important documents into my bag, along with the flash drive containing my financial records. Every movement felt deliberate, almost ceremonial. I took one last walk through the house, my eyes tracing the familiar outlines of each room. The living room where we'd once curled up together on cold nights. The dining table where we'd shared countless meals and later countless arguments. The bedroom where I'd lain awake too many nights staring into the dark. When I opened the front door, the cold air hit me like a blessing. Erin's car was idling at the curb, her face peering out from the driver's seat. I locked the door behind me and didn't look back. "Is that everything?" she asked as I slid into the passenger seat. "For now," I said. "It's enough." The drive to the apartment was quiet, except for the hum of the heater. I think Erin sensed I didn't want to talk yet. Not about the past, not about the logistics. We pulled into the lot of a modest 2-story building with pale brick walls and ivy crawling up one side. Her friend Janine was waiting at the door to hand over the keys. The apartment was small, but bright with hardwood floors and sunlight streaming through the front windows. There was a worn but comfortable couch, a tidy kitchenette, and a bedroom with just enough space for a bed and a dresser. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I dropped my bags in the bedroom and stood there for a long moment, letting the quiet sink in. No tension, no eyes following me, no unspoken accusations hanging in the air. Aaron touched my shoulder gently. "You okay?" I nodded, though my throat felt tight. "Better than I've been in months." She smiled. "Then you're in the right place." That first night, I slept deeply for the first time in what felt like years. The absence of Mark's presence was like the absence of a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying every moment of the day. The next few days were a blur of practical tasks. I met with a lawyer Aaron recommended who helped me begin the process of filing for legal separation. I changed my phone password, updated my mailing address for my bank and workplace, and made arrangements to have the rest of my belongings moved quietly. Mark's first contact came 3 days after I left. A text, "We need to talk." I stared at it for a long time before replying, "We will." Through lawyers. His response came within seconds. "You're making a mistake." I didn't answer. At Willowbrook, I told Victoria the truth that I had left my husband and was in the process of separating. She listened, then said, "I'm glad you told me. If he shows up here again, security will handle it. You won't have to deal with him alone." That promise, simple as it was, felt like another brick laid in the wall of safety I was building around myself. There were moments, of course, when the reality of it all caught up to me. Late at night, I'd think about the years we'd spent together. The trips, the dinners, the way he used to make me laugh so hard my stomach hurt. I'd ask myself when exactly it had shifted, when the man I loved had become someone who saw my success as a betrayal. But those moments passed, and each time they did, they left behind a little more clarity. One afternoon, Aaron came over with takeout, and we sat on the floor of the living room eating noodles from paper cartons. "You know," she said between bites, "you're different already." "How so you're lighter?" she said. "Like you've been carrying a backpack full of bricks for years and you finally set it down." I smiled faintly. "That's because I have." As the days turned into a week, I began to settle into my new rhythm. I woke early, made coffee in my favorite mug, and sat by the window while the sun rose. I went to work without the dread of wondering what accusations might be waiting for me when I got home. I came back to a space that was entirely mine. I knew there were challenges ahead: the legal process, the division of property, the inevitable moments when Mark would try to pull me back into his orbit. But I also knew something else: I'd already taken the hardest step. I'd left, and I wasn't going back. The first month after leaving Mark felt like standing in the quiet after a storm. The air was still heavy, the ground still damp, but the howling wind had stopped, and I could finally hear my own thoughts. At first, my days had a strange echoing quality to them. I'd wake up in my little apartment to sunlight streaming through the thin curtains and just sit there, listening to nothing. No sharp voice in the kitchen, no loaded questions over breakfast, no need to steel myself before walking into my own home. It wasn't all peace. Freedom has its own kind of ache, one you feel in the space where something toxic used to be. I'd find myself glancing at my phone, expecting a text from Mark, half dreading it, and half wondering if the silence meant he'd moved on. Sometimes I caught myself replaying good memories, like the first trip we took to the coast, or the way he used to make my tea without asking. It was disorienting, loving parts of a person who had also hurt you so deeply. But every time nostalgia tried to take the edge off the truth, I reminded myself of the donor dinner, of the surveillance photos, of the humiliation in front of my colleagues. Those weren't mistakes or slips, they were choices. And choices reveal character. At Willowbrook, my work flourished without the constant shadow of Mark's suspicion. I poured myself into the projects that followed the gala, organizing a charity auction, coordinating a traveling exhibit from Italy, and even mentoring a new hire who reminded me of myself 10 years ago, eager, meticulous, full of dreams. One afternoon, after a successful event wrap-up, Victoria stopped by my office. She leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, her expression softer than usual. "You seem different," she said. "Different how?" I asked, smiling. "Like you're breathing easier," she replied. "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." It was such a simple statement, but it stayed with me long after she left. Breathing easier. That's exactly what it felt like, as if I'd been underwater for years and had finally come up for air. Erin remained my anchor. We had dinners together, walked through the park on weekends, and she even helped me paint the bedroom in the apartment, a warm, honeyed cream. "Make it yours," she'd said, handing me the roller. And I did. Mark, for the most part, kept his distance. I'd get the occasional text. "We need to talk. I miss you." This doesn't have to be the end, but I didn't engage beyond a curt, "Please direct communication through my lawyer." It wasn't easy to resist the pull of old patterns, but each time I held the boundary, I felt stronger. Still, there were moments when the past crept back in. One evening, I was at a small networking mixer when I caught sight of a man across the room who, at first glance, looked like Mark. My chest tightened before I realized it wasn't him. But the rush of adrenaline, that old fear of confrontation, lingered for the rest of the night. Later, walking home, I thought about how deeply those reflexes were etched into me. It would take time to unlearn them. But time was something I finally had. Around the 6-week mark, I did something I hadn't done in years. I booked a solo weekend trip to the coast. No one to check in with. No itinerary to negotiate. No passive-aggressive comments about how I was spending my time. Just me, the ocean, and a stack of books I'd been meaning to read. The first morning there, I walked along the shoreline, the wind tangling my hair, the smell of salt in the air. I thought about how for years I'd been shrinking myself to fit into Mark's idea of a marriage. I thought about how he'd taken my dream job and turned it into a battleground. And I realized that in leaving, I hadn't just saved my career, I'd saved myself. By the time I drove back to the city, I felt lighter. Not because the past was gone, it never really goes away, but because it no longer defined the shape of my life. The apartment, once a temporary refuge, now felt like home. I bought a few plants, framed some photographs, even splurged on a set of linen sheets. Little things, but each one a declaration: I am here. I belong to myself. When the legal separation papers finally came through, I expected to feel triumphant. Instead, I felt quiet. The papers didn't change what I already knew: that my marriage had ended the night of the gala, and that my future was no longer tied to Mark's moods or suspicions. That evening, Erin came over with a bottle of champagne. We toasted on the balcony, the city lights stretching out below us. "To you," she said, raising her glass, "to breathing easier." I smiled, the kind of smile that comes from deep inside, to breathing easier. And for the first time in years, I meant it. In the months that followed, my life unfolded like a room slowly filling with morning light. The shapes were all familiar: my work, my sister, the city streets I'd walked 1,000 times. But they looked different now, as if the shadows had been rearranged. I didn't rush to replace anything I'd lost. I let the quiet do its work. Willowbrook entered a bright season. With the gala behind us, our calendar brimmed: a literacy fundraiser, a chamber music series, an exhibit of sculptural textiles that drew lines around the block. Victoria started handing me the kinds of decisions she used to keep for herself, not as a test, but as trust. When a donor asked who had transformed the center's public image this year, she said my name without hesitation. I felt the words land not on my ego, but on a foundation I had rebuilt brick by careful brick. I kept choosing small human things. I learned the names of the security guards I'd nodded past for years. I took my lunch outside whenever the sun allowed it and ate on the stone steps, sharing almonds with sparrows bold enough to hop close. I found a Saturday morning yoga class, and for the first time in ages, listened to my breath without anticipating an argument when I got home. These were not dramatic choices. They were ordinary, but ordinary is where freedom first makes a home. Mark's messages tapered from declarative to petulant to sparse. "You won't find anyone who cares like I did," he wrote once. Another time, I was trying to protect us. My lawyer handled the correspondence that needed handling, and I let the rest dissolve unanswered. On two separate mornings, he called from an unknown number, and I let the phone hum until it quieted. There is a kind of strength that looks like action. Another kind looks like stillness. I practiced the second one. I told very few people the whole story. Not because of shame, but because the details belonged to me. When colleagues asked how I was, I said better. When friends suggested a celebratory dinner, I said soon and meant it. Erin visited often, bringing soup, hard candy, and gossip about her neighbor's golden retriever who had learned to open the refrigerator. We laughed the kind of laugh that clears the air. One evening, I stayed late at Willowbrook to finalize the run of show for the chamber performance. The building after hours feels like a ship at sea, long dim corridors, the hum of distant machinery, the faint thrum of something alive and moving in the dark. I stood in the gallery alone and listened to the air settle around the sculptures we'd just installed. Cloth, wire, and shadow conversed in their silent language. I thought of the life I'd left. Not like a wound, but like a painting I no longer wanted in the front hall. You don't pretend it was never there. You acknowledge where the nail holes are, patch them paint, and choose something else to look at. The performance sold out twice. The second evening, a woman approached me in the lobby afterward, silver hair, bright eyes, the posture of someone who danced when she was young. "You're Claire, yes?" she asked. I wanted to say, "I brought my granddaughter tonight. She's 15. She wants to work in the arts, but her father thinks it's a frivolous dream. Watching what you've built here, watching you run a thing that matters." She saw a different map. "Thank you." I nodded, throat tight, smiled, and stepped into a quiet alcove where I told myself to breathe. There are moments when your life hands you back the time you thought you'd lost. Sometimes it arrives as applause, sometimes as a stranger's words threaded exactly where you need them. Weeks later, a letter came in a plain envelope, not from a lawyer, Mark's handwriting on the front careful and square. I stood at the counter and held it for a long moment before I opened it with the edge of a spoon. It wasn't an apology. Not really. A recounting, a justification, a paragraph that began, "I was scared," and ended with, "I hope you can understand." I read it once and then again, not to reconsider anything, but to honor the fact that I had lived this. Then I slid the letter back into the envelope and placed it in a drawer with the lease to my apartment and a handful of other papers that described a life that was now mine to maintain. Some things you keep not to revisit, but to witness yourself having survived them. Spring bled into early summer. The days stretched long and forgiving. I found myself returning to the coast on free weekends. There is a particular hour just before dusk when the water and sky speak the same gray-blue language, and the horizon is a line drawn by a patient hand. I walked there and thought about every woman I knew who had carried her strength like contraband shoved into a pocket, guarded, disguised. I promised myself I would not smuggle mine again. On a Tuesday, Victoria called me into her office. A board seat on the city's Arts Council had opened unexpectedly. "They asked for you," she said. I said yes. I laughed, half in disbelief, half in relief, the kind that shakes loose something you didn't realize you were still holding. Later that afternoon, I bought a bouquet of tulips from the corner market and set them on my kitchen table. They opened by morning blunt green, giving way to color like a secret you're finally allowed to tell. I've been asked if I regret anything. I don't. Regret imagines a version of me who knew then what I know now. She didn't. She learned. She stayed as long as it took to see the lesson and left as soon as she could carry it. There were small reckonings, too. I apologized to myself for the nights I swallowed my voice, for the ways I blamed my ambition for the shape of his fear. I wrote it in a notebook. Your light is not the crime. The sentence looked plain and almost silly on paper, but I read it every morning for a week, until it felt less like a line and more like a spine. Sometimes late, I sit by the window with a glass of water and watch the building across the way. People move through their rooms like tiny stories, a woman watering plants, a man in a red sweater practicing scales on a clarinet, an elderly couple playing cards at a small round table. It comforts me to be one life among many unremarkable and entirely my own. I don't measure the distance from who I was by how loud I can be now. I measure it by how quietly I can live without asking permission to exist. The last time Mark reached out a single sentence, "Can we talk?" I replied with the clarity I used to reserve for run-of-show bullet points. "Please coordinate through counsel." Then I put my phone down and finished slicing peaches for a tart I planned to bring to errands that evening. There was sweetness. It was not contingent on anyone's temper. At Willowbrook, I paused in the gallery after a long meeting and watched two teenagers stand in front of a piece for 10 straight minutes, not because anyone told them to, but because it held them. That is what I want my days to be, anchored to attention given freely, craft that outlives a mood. I won't pretend there isn't grief woven into this new fabric. There is. Sometimes I miss the idea of the marriage I thought I had. But I no longer confuse the idea with the reality, nor do I negotiate with the cost to keep it. I learned that you can love a person and still be unable to live inside the version of yourself they require. I also learned that leaving is not the opposite of love. Sometimes it is the most faithful thing you can do to the work you must offer the world, to the people who will be changed by it, and to the quieter future self who is waiting at a kitchen table you haven't set yet, sunlight on her hands. And if there's a revenge here, the sweet kind you clicked for, it isn't a spectacle. It's the life I wake into. It's the name I sign on contracts, the teams who look to me and find steadiness. The sister who laughs in my living room, the young woman who asks how to begin and hears me say, "Start. Start and keep your name." The other day, Daniel stopped by my office with a coffee and a question about stage plots. We talked shop, then drifted to life. He hesitated, thoughtful. "I'm glad you stayed," he said finally. "At Willowbrook, I mean. It wouldn't be this without you." I smiled, not because I needed the validation, but because the compliment landed in a place that's no longer starving. I thanked him and sent him back into the bustle with a revised diagram and a joke about Gaffer's tape, the secret savior of every event. Which is to say, I am fine. More than fine. I am in the business of making beautiful nights, and I get to go home to a piece I built myself. That's the ending I needed. That's the ending I chose. Slow fade out, 200 out of 300 words. When I think back to the first night, the call, my hands shaking, the belief that joy could enter my life without negotiation, I want to take that version of me by the shoulders and tell her two things. First, you are allowed to want this. Second, when the cost suddenly appears higher than the paycheck or the title, step back and see who's holding the bill. If it's someone pointing to your light like a neon sign for their own insecurity, put your wallet away. Walk out. Revenge was never the point. Not truly. The point was to return to myself, to wake before the city and stand in my kitchen and choose what kind of day I will make with these hands, to trust that the people who matter will stand beside me when I do, to refuse the smallness that was never mine to wear. If you're listening because you're somewhere in that dim room because someone is telling you your ambition is a wedge, your confidence a sin, or your success an alibi, Hear me, the door isn't locked. It might be heavy, but it swings. You can lift it. On the other side are ordinary mornings with coffee and quiet, and your name said kindly by your own mouth. Thank you for staying with me to the end. If any part of my story echoes yours, I'd truly like to hear it. Your turning point, your first step, your small and mighty victories. Share them in the comments so someone a little behind you can see the path. And if you want more stories like this, more truth, more breath, subscribe to Grace's Truth. We make room for the light here.